Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Nadine Khalil. I'm an art writer and editor based here in Dubai. And with me, I have online, there she is, Roxane Zand, the former senior director and Sotheby's Middle East deputy chairman and currently independent art advisor, curator, and writer, who's the executive director and co-curator of the Portrait of a Nation 2. It's my pleasure also to introduce you to Maya Khalil, who's an independent curator and art advisor based in Oxford and curator of this exhibition, Portrait of a Nation 2 Beyond Narratives. Also with us here today is Jad Melki, architect and co-founder of Ghaith and Jad, which is an architecture and design studio that basically set up the scenography for the show you see here today. So without further ado, I'm going to start the conversation to leave enough room for Q&A at the end. First, I'd like to start with the question of how all of you portrayed the nation, how you looked at the nation as part of a continuum. And I'd like to address this question to Roxane in terms of the conversation we had around living histories and how challenging it is to depict a history that is still evolving today. Roxane?
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to thank ADMAF and Her Excellency Mrs. Huda Kanu for inviting me to lead this project. Back in July 2020, it's been a unique honor and privilege. And, we've had challenging times with COVID, as you can imagine, but this is a real milestone in terms of the 50th anniversary of the nation and the 20th anniversary of ADMAF. So it's been also an incredible privilege. I am really devastated not to be there in person with you due to sudden last minute mitigating circumstances, but I warmly extend my huge thanks to the extraordinary ADMAF team for delivering the beautiful exhibition that you are seeing. In terms of living histories and continuum, I have to say, when there is an important and overarching theme like Portrait of a Nation, there are many factors to consider. And something that was very much of concern for us was, to quote Ibrahim Jabra, how to write a history of the immediate present, one that metamorphoses beyond the very moment an observer wishes to capture, how to create and preserve archives at the very moment something is happening within a society that has a huge sort of state of flux and very fast growth and transformation. So for us as curators, we thought that the thing to do would be to place the artists center stage and to hear this kind of story, if you like, through their mouths, through their perceptions and expressions. And of course, not at the same time to, overlook history. In fact, I would refer you to Maya's wonderful timeline, which is further sort of in the middle of the exhibition, that pays homage to historicity of the Emirates, and it creates a balance with the acknowledgement of evolution and progress, and yet goes beyond a linear sort of structure or narrative. So we tapped into Derrida's notion of encounters, which is an idea of looking at constellations, of collaborations, to again pay tribute and testimony to a polyphonic society. This has been very much a guiding principle. And I hope that within what you see, the 5 thematic breakdowns of the show, you see this continuum, but also the different ways in which thematically the subject has been addressed. And over to you again.
Thank you so much, Roxane. I'm really glad that you mentioned the term archive and chronology. And now the question that I would like to address to Maya is what I think is really remarkable about this exhibition and what was pulled off really beautifully is this juxtaposition between the contemporary and what can be considered the historical or the recent historical. And I want you to basically tell us more about what were the curatorial decisions that informed how you would place these different timelines, so to speak, together, and also the contribution to the oral history that you have introduced into this exhibition through the interviews that you did, which are at the very end of the show. And it's also important to note that even though the history maps a form of alternative to a chronological or a linear exhibition, it also does end with the context or the timeline that presents the linearity, but it's only after seeing the themes that have brought everything together does the viewer actually experience the timeline and then can go through the exhibition again. So maybe first if we can just talk about these wonderful juxtapositions between artists from different time periods together and then the oral history or the archive that you've created in this show.
Maybe I'll start. Maybe I'll start how we actually approach this exhibition, because then it will explain how we ended up with moving away from a chronological narrative. So we try to move away from a chronological narrative, and we try to move away from the idea of a narrative which has a beginning and an end, and looked at the development of the art scene more a sort of mapping, where you can approach a map from different vantage points. Our approach from the very beginning has been an approach based on encounters. Encounters with people, with their histories, with stories. We conducted, and I can't remember the number of interviews we had, and we dug really deep into stories and word of mouth and archival material. And what was translated from all of this research was that there wasn't clear cuts between the development of the art scene. This is an older generation that is very much still engaged in the contemporary art scene. So there is a lot of overlap between mentorship and between groupings coming together and moving apart and other forming. So it was very natural then to identify ideas, frameworks of ideas that were prevalent, and this is why we divided the exhibition at the beginning as a structure of 5 themes, moving from the idea of home and the idea of belonging, and more not only as a spatial definition, but also as a more an abstract form of idea of belonging, into this changing landscape, these configurations of groupings that came together very early on, but then continued and inspired other groupings, to redefining language and reclaiming language, and finally with shifting sociality. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this.
Yeah, and when you say language, I think it's so interesting that you use this word of togetherness, because the togetherness actually reflects the clustering that you've done in this exhibition. Earlier today when we were speaking, you said something that I thought was beautiful, that not just did one generation keep watch or shepherd the other, but also there was a living transfer of thought, and you can still see the lineage of, for example, Hassan Sharif through different artists today, but not just Hassan Sharif. It's also this idea of language that is shared in different forms, from, let's say, the more calligraphic to more contemporary forms. And, you know, language brings this idea of polyphony and polyvocal, kind of the polyvocal elements in the exhibition. And this is where I want us to start breaking down the idea of the nation, because in this exhibition, the nation is not only polyvocal, it's not only plural, it's also a body. So there are very different features of the nation that you try to tackle in this show. The nation becomes almost like a metaphor and a scene of congregations. And this is where I would like to address my next question to Jad. How did you map out all the ramifications of nation? Sorry, this is a bit close.
Thank you, Nadine.
What kind of experience did you create for the viewer?
Well, the first thing you realize when you come into this exhibition is that the entire space is really crafted or sculpted by light. So everything is black, all the walls are black, but the light is really giving importance to every single piece in the show. At the end of the day, we had a lot of pieces. This is a very rich show, around 200 pieces that are being exhibited, and you needed to give each one its value. What was really nice is that with the idea and with the approach that Maya came to us with, the idea of no timeline, the idea of mapping all of these different artists, whether they were modern or contemporary, placing them in one space, we created a diagonal grid that niched all of these different artists depending on their mediums. So when this diagonal grid opens up, it creates space for bigger sculptures, and all its walls host all the paintings and the things that are more 2D and visual on the walls. And at the center, in the central axis of all of this, we created 5 different rooms for also another experience where you have installations that need to be experienced differently. They need to be much more contained. They needed those kind of spaces, and these 5 different rooms had even a different height in them. So spatially, we were able to create this kind of tour all around the exhibition without creating a one-line curatorial walkthrough. So there's always a small niche to go into, a space to discover as you are moving along this map that we have created.
Yeah, and that whole layout echoes in the way that you've kind of demarcated the captions as a map. And so it's interesting because then it's like a double vision. This exhibition is completely a double vision. There are 2 different accounts, which are not very rigid. They bleed into one another. And then when the viewer is in this space, the tags are not under the work. So you actually look at it from a mapping point of view. So I really feel like mapping extended beyond space and beyond time to create this kind of visual sensory experience. But I want to go back to this idea of the nation in terms of how, especially in relation to the UAE and the way it's attached to other nations. And in Roxane's curatorial essay, you talk about the idea of a nation as a sanctuary. And in Maya's essay, you look at this idea of encounters, right? Of one space giving rise to another, of, you know, an older generation of artists who were supported by the government to go to Cairo, where they came up with this idea of different art spaces that they could build. And this was before the Emirates Fine Arts Society in 1980. So in a way, there's a very rich account of all the background that kind of led to this show. And I think something that really struck me that you said, Maya, is even though the show is very thematically secure, the themes came out of the research, not the other way around. So what I want us to look into is this idea of representation. So how do you represent the nation? Here you have, let's say, almost 200 works, as Jad said. You have 37 Emirati artists and 25 who were resident artists. And I want us, maybe if Maya, you can mention something about some of the artists you were involved with, and Roxane as well, in terms of this idea of national representation and looking at it in a very alternative way.
Would you like me to start, or Roxane?
Yes, go ahead, Maya.
All right. First of all, I would not say that we started with an idea of representing the nation. I think it was more, we started with the idea of looking at this scene, as understanding the scene that existed, but not only independently of what was happening and the development of the nation itself. So it was infused by a nation that was going through acceleration, going through change, tremendous change, where the physical landscape was changing, but also the social landscape was changing. And the artists were reacting, were part of this, sometimes reacting because the changes were, in a way, maybe violent is not the right word, but it was this accelerated change was happening in a very short period of time. But they also infused that change. When we talk about spaces, it's true. These spaces of congregation were happening in different ways. It started with a group of artists that studied in Cairo and came back, but there's also other artists, for instance, like Abdelkader Reyes, who studied in Kuwait, and he started practicing very early age in Kuwait, others in Iraq, and some in Sudan. I mean, there were all of this generation of local artists who studied abroad, but also regional artists that came to the UAE and infused the scene. Now, from represent or maybe commenting on the idea of nation, we have a number of artists, for instance, like Hind Mizena, when she looked at archival material of a dance competition that happened in London, the World Disco Competition, and she discovered this footage of an Emirati representing the country in 1980 in London. And commenting on it with now, what did it mean at the time and what does it mean now? when the body becomes actually a space. It's space of negotiation, a space of identity. When is the body a space for personal and private, and when is it actually an image of a nation, of a...
And I think in your essay you cited the cultural foundation that actually personified itself as a body when it developed in 1980.
Yes, it was to fulfill this vision of Sheikh Zayed of a nation that cannot exist within a culture, and cannot develop without developing in parallel a cultural structure, but also an archival, and because at first the Cultural Foundation was set up as a library,
in other words, the nation is conflated with so many other things. One of them is home, which we will get to soon. But yes, go on.
So yes, the Cultural Foundation became the heart, more like a beating heart for the idea of the nation. But I was saying that these spaces were infused or impacted the groupings, but also the grouping impacted the spaces. For instance, the Cultural Foundation was a space where Friends of the Art Group was set, and a number of exhibitions were taking place, but also these groups and the history of Cultural Foundation infused the future of the Cultural Foundation, because when the Cultural Foundation closed for a certain period of time for renovation, the idea of what it would be after it opens was very much shaped by what the people wanted, what the community wanted also for this. So this is why we are concentrating here on the idea of groupings, not only of artists, but early on it was a very wide grouping of art critics, of journalists, of poets, of writers. Now maybe it's becoming more of artists, but these configurations are changing.
And Roxane, this idea of sanctuary is very significant given your specialty as well with especially modern Iranian art. Can you tell us something about that as well?
Indeed. Well, I've always been fascinated by the notion of how the UAE has acted as a hub and a sanctuary for artists coming from surrounding nations, whether they're Lebanese or Syrian or Iranian or Saudi. It attracts a lot of artistic and creative, how can I say, expressiveness. And I likened it in my essay to the idea of how the Mughal court in the 16th century was acting as a sanctuary, where artists were flocking from other neighboring nations because there was patronage, because there was appreciation and support. So for that reason, I think it was really fascinating for me to see that what we call resident artists. There's almost an equal breakdown of Emirati artists and resident artists, those who come to the UAE to practice and have their studios and so forth. And they are part of these groupings. And it kind of links to the idea of home, what is home and what is considered a place of dwelling. And that's obviously, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but this notion of sanctuary was very important to me. I found, for example, that the well-known Iranian collective, Ramin Rukni Hayrizadeh and Hissam Rahmanian, their two Venuses are represented in the exhibition, and their collective work is a very special one in that their practice engages with reconfiguring the known to bring in collaboration and a flux of collaboration, not just between themselves, but with other artists as well. And they're well known for their various kind of congregational installations. And of course, they've found this home, if you like, in the UAE, where they practice and they draw in the works of other practitioners and artists in that way. And similarly, for example, another artist in the exhibition, Amar Al-Attar, I found that work, particularly the work that you will see of the doors, multiple photographs arranged in a grid, where his notion was to take photographs of the various communities who came to Dubai and commissioned, well, not commissioned, but had doors made to their dwellings. And these doors, which are symbolic in more than one way, obviously, because doors are a gateway to so many other things in mind and spirit. These doorways reflect different designs that somehow reflect also the background of the communities that were coming into the UAE as labor and otherwise. So lots of influence of not just Arab influences or even national and heraldic influences, but also of South Asian imagery and so on. This I think has been very an important part of the scene and feeds into what I call Edouard Glissant's idea of what is cultural effusiveness? What is it a cultural homogenization? Is it that through the sharing of culture, we diminish our cultural identity or not? And certainly I think that the exhibition reflects how we enrich ourselves through these cultural dialogues rather than being diminished. And that I think this dialogue in relationship with autonomies and particular individual expressions makes it a very interesting way of looking at things.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a real question. How do you assert autonomy within the collective? And I think one of the strong threads in the exhibition is looking at certain aggregations of practices, like, for example, found objects, accumulating found objects. This exists throughout until the most recent one by Iman al-Hashimi. But this also brings me to, before we go to home and how fractured it is, because in a way it's a bit of a stereotype about the UAE of being a landscape in flux. So I want us to talk about how artists are witnesses to the changes that occur in a short span of time. And, you know, Maya, you've gone through like some more historical artists, let's say like Talgesir Hassan, and someone like Ayman Zidani, who's relatively, I mean, I wouldn't say new because he's been working here for a while, but he's a young artist, both of whom are responding to the environment by developing their own very specific language. And so I want you to maybe explain a little more about the shifting landscapes section of the exhibition as compared to the shifting sociality, which are both about flux, but in a very, very different sense, and also they have a very different feel in the layout of the exhibition.
Yeah, we decided to actually address shifting landscape as a section and shifting sociality as a section, because the changes that were taking place at the urban level in the UAE were extremely important in how artists reacted to these changes. The younger generation, especially the younger generation, like in the work of Afra Dahiri, for instance, or even the work of people that have lived here, not necessarily Emirati, like Manarat Al Saadiyat, who also launched her series, If I Forget You, Don't Forget Me. The idea of memory is extremely important. And this memory is because even though they come from a younger generation, the past is the changes that are happening. So a lot of things that they grew up with do not exist anymore. They've changed and they've morphed. And their practice is almost like living the past in the present. And that has been impacted by a very quick change in the urban landscape and the development of the UAE. And a number of artists, somebody like, for instance, Tariq Roxane, or Hassan Sharif with an artwork, Towers, from 2008, document, I mean, almost like a document to that changing urban structure. Neighbors from Mohammed Qazim also commenting on an urban landscape and that is changing by the day, and commenting on the people that are actually involved in that change, the workers, like Roxane was saying, the people that came here to work and to be part of these changes. So the landscape has impacted the social, but then the social also is impacting the landscape. And why sociality? Because sociality, there is this idea of grouping. It's like it's almost like you belong to a group. Groups are being formed, but then even these groups, the structure of these groups is changing. And somebody like Ibtisam Abdelaziz or Iman al-Hashimi with her 1,000 spoons are commenting on this mass production that is suddenly, and the excess and the numbers, and trying to redefine the idea of value, or the idea of the individuality, or the idea of being part of a larger
And sometimes the most striking view is the outsider view, right? Like James Clark's really bleak look at the financial collapse of 2008. I mean, really, just to show how artists are, no matter where they're from, they are witnesses and they are reflections of what's going on in the society or environment around them. And I found that, I mean, I hadn't seen that work before. And I mean, I know that James Clark actually built himself here. I found it quite stunning, actually. And also Vivek's work on Hassan Sharif. I mean, this idea of congregation, and also what I found beautiful about your curatorial essay is a diffuse community, this concept. And so even within the togetherness, there are always these strands that kind of, are diffused or get diluted, and it's almost like an orbit. I guess the layout also reflects that. And I'm interested in this idea of sound and how you managed to separate the sound, Jad. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more, because I'm sure it was challenging. There are many, many works, and I know that one way is by creating these niches and pockets that people could experience works in a very personal, intimate way. But then the living histories and the archives are a lot more open.
Well, to add to what Maya was saying, the idea of togetherness was something very important for us to show, even spatially. So at the end of all these extended walls that you have in the space, you have mirrors in some moments. So one of my best moments is you're standing, you're looking at Hassan Sharif's spoons and embodying, and in the mirror you're looking at Sheikh al-Mazroua's piece hanging on the wall and her sculptures on the floor. So this kind of togetherness, and they have a story between them, you feel free to tell that, was exactly what we were trying to do. So not to separate these different artists, but somehow create a visual relationship between all of their pieces. Sound-wise, even as you were saying, we have sound showers everywhere that really separate the sound from room to room. The person experiencing the space is already in this like black. Where we erase basically the space, and as you're moving, you start to hear the installation that's coming out of a room or that is in the middle of the space, and then wherever you are standing in this vast exhibition, you can hear what you need to hear from the artist.
So there's like a certain porosity, and again, this goes back to the idea of exchange. But going again to this idea of home, which is kind of broken down into fragmentation, subjectivity, fiction, in the case of Mays El-Beik, I wanted to ask Roxane, who's been here since a while, since the early 2000s, how do you see the scene evolving through the eyes of the artists who you worked with?
Well, the evolution of the scene since the 2000s has, as you can imagine, been extraordinary. And it's actually, for me, a real privilege to have witnessed it. And of course, through the eyes of the artists, through their expressions, we get to see the articulation of what that means. So, for example, there is always this very strong dialectic, strong kind of dialogue between what was, the respect for what existed, and also the innovations, the fast pace of change, and the documentations that the artists have done to reflect this kind of transition. So, for example, if you look at the works of Her Highness Sheikh Latifa bin Maktoum, which are actually very sort of expansive theatrical photographs, they like to specifically show the city's tense dynamic between rapid development and the strongly held traditions. And of course, at the axis of this change, which is sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes extraordinary, you see women being shown as the bearers of history. They're standing slightly forlorn at the index of this change, but that's a gender issue, that's a separate conversation. But these reflections are very highly, in a sense, both tangible and touching to look at. Tariq Al-Hussein similarly talks about, his series In Beautification was shot on Saadiyat Island in 2011 and documents the very first stages of construction on the island. And of course, there's the straightforward images, but at the same time, it draws the viewer to look at the zero-sum equation between the natural environment and development. And this is actually a kind of preoccupation that a lot of artists reflect. And for me, Tariq's work is really interesting because it again reflects that kind of group and collaboration mentality. It's the result of intensive workshops between Stephen Shore and the younger UAE artists like Amar Al-Attar, Afra Dahiri, Sheikh Latifa Maktoum, and Maita Demithan. So all of these sort of depictions have a kind of significance beyond what you just see. So yes, and Muhammad Kazim, obviously, these earlier artists drew on their notion of home, the transformations that was happening in the home, and what does it imply, looking at the future through the lens of the present. It is very interesting for me that home starts, for me anyway, as I say personally, starts with the notion of who we are. Where is the starting point? But then again, within the exhibition, even that notion is challenged because Speciale de Marchi wants us to look at home not just as a feeling, but as all the other confluences, all the other configurations and reconfigurations that inform that notion. And of course, we live in a global world. We live in a kind of melting pot in many places. And the Emirates is a very special example of it. So home, yes, is a very important theme within this exhibition.
Yeah, and it's a shifting site, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap this up in around 5 minutes. I have 2 more questions. Maya, you wanted to add to that? Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add to that idea of, again, spaces, because and change, whether at the whether it's physical landscape or whether it's more like at the social level, because we started with almost like having 3 different centers for the development of the art scene. Obviously, there's Sharjah very early on with the founding of the Emirates Fine Art Society, but also with the Malaysia studio of Hassan Sharif, where you feel that, and also with the Sharjah Biennial, and especially when Sheikh Ahour took over in 2003. So there is this idea of a serious, more like education-based, rigorous critical practice. And you have the idea of Dubai in the early 2000s, more like a financial center, more like the art market, the gallery systems. And you move to Abu Dhabi, which was more like the center of these, more like at the international institutions. But then all of this moves, because after 2008, there is almost like you feel there is a shift, a consolidation phase, where there is a focus that is given to education, the development of programs at universities, art program at universities. There is, for instance, the Sheikh Salama Emerging Artist Fellowship, the critical practice of Tashkil, Art Dubai's Artists in Residence, and the Global Art Forum, and so on and so forth, beyond art, Abu Dhabi's Beyond Art. So there is this, and it's these clear divisions is not that clear anymore, because there is an infrastructure that is being put in place.
I always call it the formalization of the industry here, or the institutionalization, even though they're young institutions, you know.
Yes, yeah, they are young, but there are definitely young institutions, but there is also now within this, there is very recently where we feel there is almost like, I wouldn't say a move away from the institution, because it's extremely dependent on the institution, but there is this young initiatives of wanting to create the grassroots, wanting to operate outside the structure of an institution. Absolutely. It's very interesting how it's happening.
Yeah, it's just a different underground.
If I could just add, actually, just to underpin what Maya has said and what you have said, Nadine, I'd love to just quote Muhammad Kazim, because he said on more than one occasion that while, and the artist really underpins all this, while in the 1980s artists struggled, shows were very few, there are now larger networks of art professionals to collaborate with, and careers in the arts have become viable. There is an art ecosystem that's capable of sustaining the industry, and I think that kind of underpins what we've said just now.
And also art has become a profession.
Yeah.
Very much so here. Professionalization is really big. But I want to end with a couple more things. One is looking at 2 accounts or 2 lenses through which you can look at this exhibition. One that's a certain chronology, let's say a spatial configuration, and the other that's much more context driven. And I wanted to ask Jad about in a way we call them timelines, but basically the tables of the ephemera, which for me were beautifully presented in the sense that they were quite accessible, that you could really read them, because normally when you find these in shows, especially museum shows, it's really cluttered and it's, you know, so there was a huge selection, obviously, a tight selection, but this idea of like creating, for me, is more of a spatial consideration, like how you created them as lines radiating out, if you can say something about the ephemera tables.
With the idea of creating porosity and us having all of these walls, somehow we wanted to create punctures in these walls. These punctures are actual windows from one space to the other, creating connectivity between two different themes that Maya and Roxane were discussing. And within these punctures, we added those tables, those light tables that really hold all of the content that linked the different art pieces together. So when you are going through the ephemera, you understand a bit of the time period where everything came out. You would understand the different exhibitions that happened. You would understand a piece of paper or a note that someone wrote. So these are not things that we can exclude from such a show, because they're really giving context and content to the other pieces that are exhibited. So these light tables also move you through this timeline or this map that we have created spatially.
Yeah, they create a flow, right? And I want to end, or Maya, you wanted to say something?
I just want to say that this is where we move into the chronology of the exhibition. This is where, because these tables are linked to the timeline, and they represent these, almost like we divided, the way that we divided the exhibition into 5 themes, we also looked at the development of the art scene from the vantage point of 4 periods. We divided them into 4 periods. The first period being the period of plot, where foundation, where things were happening. The second period, where it's more like an overflow, where things are breaking away and creating new spaces and new discourse and new ways of looking at art and existing as. And then there is a period where this is the more like this. I wouldn't say the excess, but it's like the overflow. This is the big project, the bigger vision, and at the end, this is the last phase is more like this is consolidation phase, where you have the birth of the institutions and the education and reinforcing a scene at the foundation level, at the structure level. So these are linked to that timeline. This is how this scene has this is how we looked at this scene in terms of developing.
But yeah, I mean, your curatorial conceit, because I read your essay, and viewers here will get the chance to read it soon, but you basically, your curatorial conceit was to create a show that was much more thematically driven or content driven than chronologically driven, yet you end the show with this timeline, and then if someone reads the essay, they come to the exhibition with another account. So, I mean, it's almost, from a macro level, it's a comment on the practice of curating content and also creating different ways to look at artwork, because then the artwork then has added signification in different contexts, but then it's also a comment on the act of curating itself as a gesture. And so that act has a lot of power in some, and a high responsibility too. So my last question would be, what did you leave out? Because I mean, obviously, you couldn't put everything in. So were there themes or motifs that you had to leave out, or?
I'm sure there's a lot that we left out, without a doubt, because there are different ways of looking at the scene. I think we left out a bit more the engagement of the scene and the relationship that the scene has with the region, with events that were happening, whether at the political level that have, in a way that have, quite often that have infused some of the practices. I mean, it is a region, and don't forget, I mean, it's part of the Arab world to start with, but it's also part of the Middle East. So there is the political that is taking place, that is, and even a number of these artists that are practicing in the UAE are coming from these regions that are in political turmoil, and partly this is why they are in the UAE as well. Right. So this definitely, so there are a lot of conversation and that could have been included. But
if I can interject, I would say one thing, Nadine, that you and I discussed in conversation. We didn't engage necessarily with identity politics as such. we looked at identity, we looked at home, all of those themes, but we didn't engage so much with the socio-political aspect of identity politics and representation, in the sense that we tried not to engage with the notion of representation for the sake of representation, but to fit in with the wonderful themes that Maya has come up with.
Yeah, and also Maya, when we've spoken, I think one of the strengths of this show is not highlighting one individual over the other. Even if I look at this and I see Hassan Sharif in different threads, but I also see other artists that have developed their own style, and even if it has to do with found objects, not necessarily directly linked to Hassan Sharif's. And so this is one thing that I think is kind of difficult to do in a show, to kind of cluster the show in a way while still maintaining a certain, let's say, value of each work on its own.
If I want to add one more thing, is that this show has very much relied on a number of excellent exhibitions that took place. Not only exhibitions, but also, I mean, publications and I mean, critical, obviously the artist's work. But for instance, if to give just a small example, but we cannot see them. This is an exhibition that really we digged very deep and learned so much from it. 1980 to today, also the exhibition at the Venice Biennial that curated by Khalil Qasimi, also is an exhibition that had been instrumental in infusing the material that we dealt with, and so on and so forth. Emirati expression, some edition of Emirati expression, UAE Unlimited. Made in Dubai, gold, all this gold. There's so many brilliant.
Very much so. Brilliant curatorial and discourse happening as we speak. And this is something that I personally didn't observe in other parts, certainly not in Iran at the time that things were happening there. So it's really refreshing and heartening to see so much excellent curatorial work taking place, as Maya has said here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, it also goes to show how much an exhibition can add to knowledge production. The exhibition doesn't finish when the exhibition is over, basically. It has repercussions, you know, and this is what we can see based on the lineage of other exhibitions that took place before. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.